It's time for the word of the week, and this week we have two words of the week. They are sort of synonymous with each other and can be used as synonyms, but yet there's a subtle but significant difference in their meaning. Let's take a look at both words of the week. The first up is stathos, and stathos means the breast or the upper chest, the upper torso. And then our second word is mastos, which means breasts, plural, both either male or female. And notice, in the New Testament, the word mastos is always used as a plural. I wonder why that is. Obviously, breasts, generally speaking, come in pairs, and so when we're referring to breasts, we're usually referring to a pair. So stathos, our first word of the week, gives us the English word stethoscope, a tool with which we examine the inner workings of the chest cavity. And then mastos gives us the English word mastectomy, the surgical removal of breast tissue. Not just chest tissue, but actual breast tissue. Our primary focus is going to be on stathos, but first, let's take a look at examples of mastos regarding both female and male subjects. And all of our readings today will be from the ESV with the Koine supplied. First up is Luke chapter 11, verse 27. As he said these things, a woman in the crowd raised her voice and said to him, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breasts at which you nursed." And here breasts is mastoi, the plural of mastos in the nominative case. And so there's an example of breasts mastos being used to describe breasts with their primary intended purpose, that of nursing, nourishing a baby. Now let's take a look at it applied to a male subject. This is Revelation chapter 1. It's verse 13, but I'm reading 12 and 13 to give the context. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. And chest here is tois mastois. So this is dative plural of mastos. And it's, I believe in the text, it's epi tois mastos, upon or at his breasts, tois mastos autou. And so here we have, last week on the last episode of Koine Corner, I talked about the ESV striking a nice balance between thought for thought translation and word for word translation. So if we were going word for word here, we would say around his breasts. But because we're going, in this instance, we're leaning toward more thought for thought translation, they went with chest, which is an interpretation of epi tois mastois autou, right, at his breasts. That's interpretation. It's conveying the thought, because we're not interested in his breasts in a sense of having a utilitarian function. We're talking about the location where the sash is tied, right? So you can see the significance of that. So let's look at the next text and see if this sounds familiar to you. This is also in Revelation, verse 16:5. And out of the sanctuary came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen, with golden sashes around their chests. And chests here is not mastois, rather it is ta stathe. So we've switched from mastos to stathos as our words of the week, and in a very similar description, talking about sashes, golden sashes being tied around these angels' chests, rather than tois mastois like it was in chapter 1, here we have ta stathe, to describe sashes tied around the chests of the angels. So we can see here that when talking about a location on the torso, we can use stathos and mastos as synonyms. But when we're talking about lactation, when we're talking about feeding babies, these cannot be used synonymously. There are no texts where stathos refers to nursing. It's not typically used to describe females at all, because obviously the nature of the upper chest is different for females than for males. And in 2023, that may constitute a hate crime. So let's carry on and take a look at two different types of uses of stathos, apart from that sort of geographic location that we just saw in Revelation 16. And first up, let's take a look at Luke chapter 23, verse 48. And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, the spectacle being the crucifixion, when they saw what had taken place, returned home beating their breasts. And breasts here is ta staphe, exactly like it was for the golden sashes around the chests of the angels. So they were beating their breasts, they're beating their chests. This is a widely known and accepted form of expressing grief or outrage, either sorrow, beating of the chest in sorrow, or as an expression of outrage, like, I can't believe what I've just witnessed here today. Jesus uses this phrase in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, where he contrasts how the Pharisee sees himself as upright and righteous, where the tax collector goes to the temple and pleads for forgiveness. And what he says this is in Luke 18:13, if you want to go and read it, but I'm just going to read, we won't look at it, I'm just going to read the Greek. He says, etupten, he struck to stathos autou, his chest, legon, while saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Like as a sign of grief. Oh, I'm such an unworthy sinner. God, please be merciful to me. Right? So this is a well-known symbol, this beating of the chest, for either grief or outrage. Now finally, let's take a look at stathos in a relational context. This is John chapter 13. I'm going to read 23 through 25. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. Now notice, at Jesus' side here is ento kolpo tu Jesu. And if you think back to the King James, I believe it says at the bosom of Jesus. So kolpo, somebody right now is saying kolpo is another word for chest or breast. Why didn't you do that? I'm glad you caught that. I'm glad that you asked. So to kolpo, from kolpos, kolpos is bosom or chest, but in the New Testament it is almost always either metaphorical, so it's not to be taken literal, it's symbolic, like being gathered into the bosom of Abraham, or it refers to the upper folds of the garment. So it's not about the person's chest, it's about the clothing that they're wearing, or being used sort of symbolically, metaphorically, etc. That's why I didn't include it as one of our words of the week. I'm talking about the actual chest, whether it be stathos or mastos, and not sort of a figurative use of bosom, kolpos. So let's carry on. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, this is stathos to Jesu, at the chest, at the torso of Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? This is in response to one of you will betray me. So what do we see here? We see that stathos against his chest, that John can be leaning up against Jesus, they're shoulder to shoulder, they're upper torso to upper torso, and figuratively we can talk about that in terms of the kolpos, ento kolpo tu Jesu, at in the bosom of Jesus, but not like being held like a child, figuratively being close to him. And then we get elucidation that he's at the stathos of Jesus, right? Epi to stathos to Jesu, against the upper torso, against the chest of Jesus. He's close to him. Proximity. It's showing the relational closeness of the two people. So as you can see, we can use stathos and mastos as synonyms, particularly if we're referring to males, like Jesus and the figurative description of angels wearing the golden sashes. But when we're talking about females, we almost always use mastos because of the biological difference between males and females. Stathos cannot communicate the same notion as mastos because stathos never means breasts, which are for the purpose of lactation. Both of them can just mean the upper chest for the purposes of geography. We saw that in the two Revelation quotes. What do I mean by geography? Just the location of the sashes. Or about proximity. John is described as being closest to Jesus based on being upon his chest. And we can use it as the locus of expression of grief or outrage. They're beating their chests to show grief and or outrage. So stathos, mastos are two words of the week, and a little bonus word of the week, kolpos, which is usually figurative, bosom, like being gathered into the bosom of Abraham, or the folds of the upper garment that a person might flesh out to carry something home. You know, they poured out the wheat into it and you carried it home in the bosom. The bosom of the garment, not the bosom of the human. Right. So those are our words of the week. I hope that was good for you. If it was, please like, share, subscribe, tell a friend so that the channel can grow and that I can continue delving into this magnificent language of Koine Greek, the language in which the New Testament was written. And until we see one another again, charis kairene humin, grace and peace to you.